probably fair to say that most of us who are PC gamers at one point in our gaming careers probably had a GTX 1660. Personally, I've had a few of them. I've had the 1650, I've had the 1660 base, I've had a 1660 Super. Now, I did get these while I was still building PCs and selling them, so it makes sense that I had so many. But the point I'm making is that these cards, while maybe not legendary in terms of something like a 1080 Ti, they are legendary in just how popular they were, and to an extent still are. And when it comes to HD gaming in 2026 and even going into 2027, the question remains, what is the sort of best value for money HD gaming graphics card when you compare things like technology, ray tracing, the amount of cores that it has, the specs, the output, the inputs, which ports it has, the raw power consumption, the raw power output. When you compare all these things, I think this card is still a strong contender. Now, when I say RTX, of course, this isn't a ray tracing capable card. These were the cards made, after. These were probably I think actually the last GTX cards made before ray tracing was set in production, at this point, probably around 5, 6, 7 years ago. Probably more, actually, probably a decade. And so these cards are interesting because while not the most powerful thing in today's market, they are still very capable of playing games if you don't care about ray tracing, and of course if your games don't require it. Now, this video isn't about ray tracing, so I'm not going to get too into that, but ray tracing hasn't taken off the way that I think Nvidia thought it would, at least in terms of gaming. And so it's interesting that cards like these are not left behind too much because there is still capacity to use them. But, exaggerated long intro out of the way, let's talk about the card itself and why I think it's still an interesting choice in 2026. The card is a good balance because it has 6 gigs of video memory, which isn't, much, but AMD just announced a card with 4 gigs and we're in 2026. So, maybe at the moment it's not that bad. It has 1,408 CUDA cores, which, against modern cards isn't a lot, but it's still enough for HD gaming. And it only draws 125 watts of power. So when it comes to gaming, it's not a heavy power draw. The base clock for this card, of course, you get different shrouds and different companies, but it's around 1,500 megahertz with a boost clock of around 1,785. Up to 1,830. It does use the Turing architecture, which is, old at this point, but it's still relatively decent for gaming. And it has a bus width of 192-bit, memory speed of 14 gigabyte per second, and a bandwidth of 336 gigabyte per second. Oh, there's a fly or something. So it requires a 450 watt power supply, and it uses an 8-pin. Now, again, dependent on shroud and company. And it is, of course, a PCI 3 card because it is relatively outdated. Now, depending on which one you get different outputs, but generally they'll come with, HDMI, DVI for some of them, and DisplayPort. Now, the DVI is interesting because you don't get that much these days. So this would probably be my pick for a non-RTX card. And of course, one of the factors that I didn't mention, and probably the biggest one, is price. Because in South Africa, this card is 2,000 Rand. Now, you can only get it secondhand at this point. I mean, you can still get it new in some place. It'll be around 4,000 Rand, which isn't bad for a new card. But secondhand 2,000 Rand is not a lot for a graphics card. I got one for 1,500 Rand. So compare that to the AMD variant at the price is something like a RX 580, which has more VRAM, but it's a much slower card. Compare that to the 2060, which I would say is this card's counterpart in terms of RTX. But now the price is about 35% higher. It's about 3,200, 3,400 Rand. So, whereas the 1660 Super is $150, the 2060 is $200 to $250 secondhand. Now, that is the South African local market. I'm not sure what it's like overseas, but it's interesting to note. And, while this card is slightly stronger, it's not that much stronger in terms of HD performance, but you do get that ray tracing capability. So I would probably go for this, but I don't think this is my pick for the lowest possible, still usable graphics card for HD gaming. I'm not going to go through the specs of this one too much. I just wanted to make a quick comparison. I would probably pay the extra 1,000 Rand to get ray tracing just because it enables you to play more games, but I don't think it's a necessity. So we'll quickly see how this card does in 2026. I'm pretty curious, and we'll see if it is actually still usable in today's gaming climate. Let's do it. So first up here, we have Black Myth Wukong. This is running at 1080p medium settings with FSR set to quality. And I think FSR and, all of the upscaling technologies like DLSS and the Intel one, which I'm forgetting right now, I think they help a lot when it comes to games like these, games that technically are a bit too difficult for this card, but if you use these technologies, you can still play. So this is pushing the card. It is at around 98%. Temperatures are relatively high as well, but it was getting around 45 FPS, which I think it's decent. Moving on to the new Black Flag 1080p medium settings, FSR quality, and we are getting again around 45 FPS, which these are playable results. These are console equivalent results for some consoles. If you're comparing the card to a console, it would probably be in between a PS4 Pro and a PS5. Of course, the PS5 is much more performant than a 1660, but just in terms of placing it somewhere, it would be in between there. This is playable, and these aren't the lowest settings. It doesn't even look bad. It looks quite nice. Again, the card is working very hard. The system is a i5-12400F, which may be a little bit overkill for this card. Also having 32 gigs of RAM, but it's not an unfair comparison as to what people would have in today's climate for their computers. GTA 5, this was popular when the card came out. 1080p, very high settings. This won't have any issue running at above 80 FPS. The new Forza game, 1080p high settings with TAA enabled, and we are getting above 60 FPS. And I think that's my point with this card is, if you're okay with 1080p for one, and maybe not the highest settings in all games, but some games you can still do it. You have to use stuff like temporal anti-aliasing or or different upscaling techniques, but it's a playable result, and it looks good, and it's above 60 FPS, so that's actually quite impressive. This is where it might get difficult, and this is Spider-Man 2, a game that technically is a little bit too new for this graphics card. 1080p low settings with TAA enabled, and we are getting around 50 FPS. Now, this is low settings, so in some games you're going to have to be okay with playing at low settings, but it is above 45 FPS. It is a playable result. It's not going to be super responsive. You see some lag spikes. It's not going to be super responsive, but you can definitely play. And I think that's quite interesting. A game like this requires a good CPU as well, and some RAM, but you can definitely still play. Crimson Desert, another new, relatively demanding game, using FSR, mostly medium settings, and getting around 40 FPS. Now, for me, this is maybe a little bit low. I would probably drop the settings to low or the FSR to performance, but it is technically strictly playable. I probably wouldn't even play this on this because it starts to look a little bit pixely and smudgy, and I probably wouldn't play games that the card can't really play, just because it would annoy me. But technically, it is a playable experience. Battlefield 6, new shooters in 2025, 2026, something like this. 1080p low settings TAA, getting around 70 FPS. Now, this is probably how I would play something like Battlefield or Call of Duty because, the performance is important. But for the single player, I probably would put it on medium settings and just have around 50 FPS, something like that. Arc Raiders, quite a well optimized game. 1080p, high settings. Temporal anti-aliasing enabled, and we do get around 65 FPS, and this looks really good. So that's a good surprise. Definitely some AA games will play quite well. 007 First Light, quite a difficult game to run. 1080p low settings, FSR set to quality, getting around 50 FPS. The game looks really nice. Something like this, a little bit more difficult to run, but you can still play. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. We'll take a look at a few more here. Horizon Forbidden West, 1080p medium settings, TAA, 54 FPS. That's quite good. It's close to 60. That's not a bad result at all. The new Dying Light game, Dying Light the Beast. This game I actually do want to play because I'm playing Dying Light 2 right now. And 1080p low settings, around 50 FPS. So, not the best result there, but playable, definitely. Yeah, I'm quite interested in playing this game, so I'm not going to check it out too much. Something like Cyberpunk, 1080p high settings. This game is older at this point, and we do get around 50 to 60 FPS. But you'll see in all of these games the GPU is being throttled quite highly by just having to, the CPU and the RAM are being throttled by the GPU. The GPU is being a bit of a bottleneck, is what I meant to say. So, the CPU and RAM are maybe a bit too strong for the graphics card. Maybe something like a 10400 would be a better CPU. But I mean, you'd rather have a more powerful CPU, and it is, those components are cheap compared to a graphics card. Hogwarts Legacy, a game that's a little bit older, 1080p medium settings, getting around 60 FPS, and it looks good. I think there are a lot of games like these that are still very playable on cards like these. We'll take a look at one or two more. I think Alan Wake 2 might be a bit difficult. Yeah, 1080p low settings, FSR quality, and this is an example of a game that is maybe just crossed that boundary of not really being all that playable anymore. It does get up to 45, maybe 50 in some cases, but you don't want to be playing at around 35 FPS. That's just a little bit low. Technically playable, but it's a bit too low for my taste. Anything under 45 is a no for me. So it is getting to that age now where some games are just too new for it. Counter-Strike 2, 1080p medium settings. I'd probably play it low, getting around 200 FPS. This one was never in doubt, but just to show you that, buy a PC with a 10th gen i5 or even i3. Just make sure it's at least a 6-core CPU. Get yourself 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM, a 512 gig SSD, a cheap case, cheap power supply, and a 1660. You're paying under 7,000 Rand, and you're getting an esports capable PC that can still play all of these games, even AAA games. So while gaming is an expensive hobby nowadays, that just applies to the best of the experience. Experiences like these can be had for relatively cheap, especially if you compare it to what consoles cost now, because you're paying PS4 prices for a PC like this, and it plays games that the PS4 just can't do. Ghost of Tsushima, 50 FPS, 1080p medium settings, playable, not the best result, but definitely playable. Red Dead Redemption, something that I would play on this. Mixture of medium and high settings, 1080p, TAA, getting around 60 FPS. Very good result. Again, quite, CPU is important there, but very good result. Lastly, here we'll take a look at The Last of Us Part 1. This is running at medium settings, TAA, HD. This is the remastered, so it's a bit more difficult to run, getting around 50 FPS. So a playable result, looks amazing. So yeah, definitely playable. Let's talk about it for a little bit. So, you know, I went into this test a little bit blind because I haven't touched this card in a long time. I haven't, checked how they do in today's market in a very long time. But the reality is that if you want to play games and your budget is extremely low, this is probably the best choice for you, because if saving something like $60, $70 is important to you, then the difference between this and a 2060 is $60, $70, at least in South Africa. And so it makes sense to save that money, get this card, accept that you're not going to be playing ray tracing titles and that you're not going to be using ray tracing or any of the new technologies. But the thing is, if you're not buying a Blackwell card, a 50, at least a 5050, then you're not really going to have access to the newest technologies anyway. And so it doesn't really matter all that much unless you, for some reason, want to play ray tracing games at the lowest settings anyway, because those cards really aren't capable of ray tracing anyway. Technically they are, but they don't have enough cores. They only have about 30 cores. So I would say this is a good bet for a budget gaming computer. I think it makes sense to get something like this in terms of graphics. You can buy secondhand components to match with it, and get yourself a nice gaming PC for cheap, and just enjoy games with your buddies. You'll have to tune out the noise about everyone and their new graphics card and the performance that they get and all of that stuff. But the point of this video is more just, is it possible to get a cheap graphics card that can still play games in 2026? And it definitely is possible. I'm surprised that the card is lasting this long, because it does kind of show the decline in computing performance. While that is a good thing for consumers, because cards like these that are more than a decade old can still be used today. When I was growing up, think about something like the GTX 560. That's a card that I had. I had an MSI Twin Frozer 560. I think it had like 2 gigs of VRAM, if I remember correctly, which was impressive at the time. But, that card was kind of like a flagship card at that point. And the cards that came before it, thinking about something like a GTX, I think I had a 270 or something at some point. Something like that. I don't remember exactly. But the 270 couldn't touch games that the 560 could. And that is the difference in the market stagnation that we have now, which technically is not a good thing. But for consumers, it means you don't have to upgrade that much, because you can still play with cards like these. But anyway, this video is going on way too long. I'm just talking nonsense now. So can you game with a GTX 1660 in 2026? You definitely can. Should you? Depends on your budget. So that's about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.